to be here. It's good to engage all of you. You know, I was asked to talk on a couple of topics here, and my philosophy is that change management is the topic that kind of relates best to what you all are involved in. It's a time of change, given what we know is happening in the nation and in the world right now. And it's something that I'm quite familiar with in terms of the transformations that I've led. And so I have a presentation here that I can highlight for you. And then we can have some discussion. Well, look, in our society today, we are actually dealing with unprecedented change. And it's highly correlated to the transistor, to be totally honest with you. And one of the ways we look at it is years to 50 million users. It took radio 38 years. It took television 13. It took the cell phone 7 years to get to 50 million users. It took the internet 4 years to get to 50 million users. It took Facebook just 2 years to get to 50 million users. And I'd be willing to bet you that most of you have Facebook accounts. In fact, Facebook, there are more monthly active users of Facebook than there are citizens in China. It's close to 3 billion people currently. And why that's interesting is that the Chinese don't allow their citizens to have Facebook accounts in general. And so, but just 2 years to get to 50 million users. It took Pokemon Go, which, you know, if you don't know about Pokemon Go, it's probably because you're not young enough. But those of you who do, it took Pokemon Go 3 weeks, right? And here's the interesting thing. And those of you who've heard of the game Fortnite, it took Fortnite even less than that. And so what did that lead to? So if you go back and you look at 2007, in 2007, that's when we had the establishment of the iPhone. That's when it was invented. That's when you got apps. You had this whole plethora of social media that came into being. Google became a publicly traded company in 2007. So all of these things happened, and what was the outcome of that is more than half of the top 10 in-demand jobs 10 years later didn't exist in 2007. We are going through a similar transformation now. And so, and you don't realize that change because we see the world in linear fashion, but this change is happening exponentially, right? I told you earlier, it was all kind of highlighted and directly connected to the transistor. And the speed of a transistor, or the actual number of transistors on a chip, doubles every 6 months, okay? And that's a concept called Moore's Law. And so the doubling of the transistor means that the speed doubles. And if the speed doubles, then the actual size of the transistor can be half the size and produce the same amount of power. It's the reason why you can walk around with an iWatch, an Apple Watch, and that Apple Watch have a computational power greater than the early IBM computers that basically took up a whole floor in a building. And so that has driven tremendous change in our country. It's the greatest accumulator of wealth in our history. And that change is all around us. It's around us here at Mason. And you know, think about it this way. We're talking now about autonomous driving. I actually designed my first autonomous vehicle back in the late 90s. And it was a pure novelty concept back in those years. Last year, we built an autonomous dragster, okay? And it was like ho-hum. And so it's interesting to see these technologies grow and take over and produce for us. Look, in the next 5 years, there are a whole host of technologies that will become obsolete. Physical IDs, paper currency, credit cards, store cards, business cards, photos, mail and mail delivery, hard copies of books, bills and notices. Well, actually, you will always have bills. They will just be electronic, but you'll always have them. Paper, steering wheels. If you notice, when I talk a little bit about autonomous driving, but every year the manufacturers take a little bit of control away from the driver. And and every year it happens. First the cars would brake by themselves, then they would park by themselves, then they would take over for you in limited when an accident is imminent. What happens over time is we will get to a point where the vehicle, you just get in a car and there's no steering wheel and the vehicle takes you wherever it is you need to go. That changes around us so much that we're missing some aspects of change. I don't know if you've heard of CRISPR-Cas9 technology, but in CRISPR-Cas9, what that is that it involves taking a piece of RNA, and that's a chemical messenger that's designed to target a specific section of DNA or a specific section of who you are. And you can actually take out that piece of RNA and replace it with another, and thereby change that particular aspect. So if you want a kid with 20/20 vision, with a high IQ, who won't go bald and who will be a sprinter and won't have Alzheimer's, that's possible, right? I didn't say it was ethical, but it is indeed possible. And one day, in our lifetimes, not my kids, but if you are a current college student, could very well be that your children will be playing on the field with some super kid who's been modified or who's been genetically enhanced. That's the reality of the situations we're looking at today. We are actively cloning and genetically modifying all sorts of species of all sorts of entities. And there's even some suggestion that the coronavirus, the virus we're dealing with, the growing thought now is that that was an entity that was actually genetically modified in a laboratory. But more on that later. We're also dealing with tremendous competitors, and those competitors are adapting change in a remarkable degree. This is Shanghai in 1987. That's what it looked like. This is Shanghai in 2010. If I go back and highlight, you see that building there on the left with the little peak, the black peak on it? It's the same building in both pictures. And you see the remarkable transformation of what happened in that, it's basically a subdivision of Shanghai called Pudong. And you see the change that happened there remarkably. Okay, so most countries have lowered their trade barriers, privatized public enterprises, open public utilities to competition. And the reality is that they are competing with us and against us on an unprecedented level. Our economies are changing and changing dramatically. Okay, we got about 7.8 billion people on the planet today. And I can tell you now that a large number of them are in need of jobs, primarily due to the pandemic. But we have a mismatch. and the mismatch is global. So globally, right now, there are 90 to 95 million more low-skilled workers than employees have need for, okay? If you go to advanced economies all over the world, there is 45 million too few workers with the proper education than what those economies need, right? And so, and in developing countries, they have far too many people that have for lack of a better term, have the wrong type of skill. They have a lot of laboring type skill, and those countries need skills to help those entities develop. They need law, they need medicine, they need business, and the like. And so what this means is that there's a global mismatch from an education perspective. And despite the large number of academic institutions that we have across the globe, across the planet, we're not meeting this demand. This number has been consistent for a large number of years. And then in the end, technology now is becoming a real competitor to all of us. So this was a study that was done back by two fellas out of Cambridge. And what they showed is that they took a look at our all of the jobs in the US. They took a look at our employment framework, and they came up, if you just look at what digitization, artificial intelligence, and these technologies were doing, they were able to estimate that over the next 5 years or so, about 47% of US total employment is at risk due to digitization, 47%. And this was pre-pandemic when this study was done. It's a great book if you have an opportunity or chance to take a look at it. It's called The Race Against the Machine, right? And, you know, you see my little robot friend dancing there, and but the reality is that at some point that robot is going to be competing against you in a very significant way. Our students are indeed different as well. So what types of students are we educating? You know, I tell you that on a college campus, we actually have three types of people. We have what are called digital natives, and those are our students. They're tech savvy. They were born digital. They my two youngsters who are now just going to university, they have they grew up with technology in their hands, right? They had cell phones before they were 12 years old. They had the ability to engage with technology when they were very, very young, even before they could write well. They could type the names of their websites on a keyboard, and they can go to the various sites they wanted to go to. And so you have these digital natives, and then you have what are called digital immigrants, and that's many of us. We didn't necessarily grow up with it. That's the faculty of today, right? Didn't necessarily grow up with it. We learned it as a part of our jobs primarily, or as a part of a way of life that we chose for ourselves. But it wasn't innate. It wasn't natural. It wasn't there day one. I remember using payphones when I grew up. I remember using phones that actually had little circles on them that you poked your finger in and spun around when you dialed a number. And I know that there are people on this call who remember those as well. So we were digital immigrants. And then you have the last group. They're digital hostages. Not only do they resist the technology, they don't want any parts of it. And all of these individuals are on a college campus today. You know, if you can just get them to use email, they're not going to text. If you want to talk to them, you better call them. You know, we have those folk here. I've dealt with them. But our students are really, really digital natives and digital savvy. Look, education as we know it today is an 19th century construct, right? Most of our faculty are born in the 20th century, and most of our students are born in the 21st. So if that doesn't tell you that there's need for change, I don't know what else I can tell you that is. I'm going to highlight to you the things that I think are important for change. And the best way for me to do that is to first give you an example. I took over the engineering school at the University of California, Irvine back in 2011. And it was a very, you think engineering is progressive and really forward thinking. It's not. It's a typical university type major that's steeped in tradition, to be totally honest with you. And we had all of this change that we needed to bring. I had departments. Even the department that I came into was mechanical and aerospace engineering, and that department didn't have a single woman as a faculty member when I started. And I had a couple of other academic departments that didn't have any either. Just to give you an idea of how backward it was, I was the only African American in the actual School of Engineering. I was the only one, and I was the dean. Okay, so just put it in perspective. And it was growing at a tremendous rate. And the reality is that the majority of the students, a significant number of the students coming in, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 45% were people of color, primarily Latinx. And so that's kind of what I inherited. This is what the school looked like in 2009, the year before I started. You see the leadership team there on the left, all good people. Many of them are good friends of mine to this day. When I left there in 2019, that's what the leadership team looked like. Picture's worth 1,000 words. Why am I highlighting this to you? Because I'm going to talk to you about change. And if I'm going to come and talk to you about change, you need to talk to someone who's actually done it. Okay? These are the faculty hires. Remember I said that the majority of the departments didn't even have women, let alone people from underrepresented groups when I started, and this was in California. This is a smattering. This is the first 50 some odd faculty that I hired. Look at the group. You see, everybody's there. Men, women, Latinx, African American, everybody's there. 50% of all new hires. And in the end, we hired 70 people before I left there. A little bit greater than 50% were women or from underrepresented groups. And that is very, very difficult to do in engineering. Men are 5 times more likely to be hired than women in engineering. And it's 21 times more likely to hire an Asian or a Caucasian than it is to hire an African American. So it's a big deal. So of the 70 faculty we hired, 24 women, 7 African American, and 5 Latinx American. And we didn't suffer from quality. This is all the great things we did. This is everybody in here, every person highlighted there is an individual who, there's a few senior faculty, but in all those categories is a younger faculty member that was hired in that group, in that picture that I saw you. And this is all the recognition that those individuals got. We also dramatically changed the student GPA. You see, we started with 3.75 average GPA in 2011. And when I left last year, it was a 4.12 average entering GPA. And we did that with 36% of the freshmen first in their families to go to college, and well over 25% of them low income. So the question is, how do I do it? Well, we did it by change management. And no organization can afford to stand still. There's always going to be changes, and if you don't change, your competitors will. There are always better ways of doing things. And in the end, organizations don't change. People change the organization. So if you come in and don't enact any change on the organization, I can guarantee you that organization will remain the same. And that's why it's critical to create an effective change management communication framework for your organization. And you want that framework to inspire, to engage, and to support the people in your org to navigate effectively. So I highlight a couple of quotes here on change. I use this Darwin one all the time. And the idea, the reality is, it's not the most intelligent, but those that adapt. All change happens on what is called a change loss curve. And there are 3 support stages. So when you initially tell an organization that we're going to go from A to B, we're going to change and we're going to do this, the first thing you're usually met with is shock and denial. People say, first of all, they say, wow, this is too much for us. We can't do that here. It just won't happen. I've met all of that. The way you combat that is with information. You give them the facts. And so before I change an organization, I always lead with data. I always lead with, here's where we are, here's where we can go, here's where we are relative to our competitors. Because data tells the story. Data tells you who you are. You don't get to decide who you are. Your performance decides it for you. Okay? And then once you start to initiate the change based on the information you give them, you run into depression and anger, and then that moves into resignation. And in that stage, you offer people emotional support. You're really there to help them. You know, you say, I want to help you. I want to support you. I want to do things in order to make it better for you. And then you go to the final point of change, and that is guidance and direction, right? Once they get to the point of they accepted the change, they're no longer angry about it. They're accepting it. Now is the time to really get going and move things forward. And so that's kind of what I've seen. Now, let me give you, in the remaining time I have, well, 2 things. I skipped one. It's really interesting to recognize that you have 2 types of people in your org. Okay, and you can see these people on they're either on the stability end of the spectrum, or they actually exist on the change end of the spectrum. And you can see the dynamics play themselves out in any group. Okay, so stability agents tend to struggle when everything just remains the same and nothing's changing. You'll hear these people complain outwardly, vehemently about it. And then, you know, so I'm sorry, the stability agents struggle when things are changing, and things are changing rapidly. And you'll hear them complain, this is going too fast. We shouldn't be doing it this way. We need to slow down. We need to wait. It's just too much for us. Even for little small changes, they will react this way. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have change agents. And those people struggle when everything is the same and nothing changes at all. And so you really need to, you have to determine in your org and in your group who's who and who's what, because understanding that helps you to understand the dynamics. So I'm going to get off the stage here with my 8 steps to successful change. Okay. These are the steps that I follow. Sometimes the condition, you know, sometimes you're put in a certain condition, or the environment puts you in a certain place where you don't have to create a sense of urgency. The urgency is created for you. I'll give you an example. When I came to our campus, we were getting ravaged. We were dealing with the issues of coronavirus, right? We had been totally disrupted. There was no classes being offered. Everything was literally shut down. We had a financial crisis. We were looking at literally greater than $100 million deficit hole. And literally 3 days before my start date, we had students on campus march to the statue of George Mason and threaten to take it down. I had to deal with all three of those on my first day of work. So the conditions of what was happening at Mason actually provided a sense of urgency that things had to be done in order for us to move forward. So I didn't have to create them. I didn't have to establish them. They were already there. But in many cases, you won't have that given to you, and you'll have to create that sense of urgency. And then you come together and you build a coalition. You can see that we did that here on every single major effort that we took in those three areas of challenge that I just highlighted to you. We established faculty committees and task forces. Why did we do that? Because that's the coalition. Those are the individuals who will work together to help us solve the problem. And each one of those entities, you give them a vision of where you want them to be, and you let them actually determine the strategy to get there. That's how you get buy-in, right? And then you communicate that vision constantly and over and over and over again. That's why you get all the letters from me. That's why you get the emails from me. That's why we prepared video after video after video. That's the communication part of this, right? And, empower broad-based action and generate short-term wins, right? So when we're able to keep the coronavirus at bay for a certain period of time, we talk about that, we espouse it, right? Because that's a short-term win. That lets people know that what we're putting in place is working, okay? And what you then do is you start to consolidate those short-term wins, and that opens you up for doing bigger things. Well, what was the bigger thing for us? I'm using this whole issue with coronavirus because it was there in front of me. It was what we were met with. And so what we did was we used that to develop an opportunity to grow and expand some major laboratories out on the SciTech campus, right? We knew that we could get some funding from the government for them. We knew we had the faculty and the expertise there, but they needed equipment. And we made a deal. Look, if you'll do some of this coronavirus testing and this other stuff for us, we will work with you and the state government and the federal government to get you all of this really powerful equipment that you can use even once we get past this crisis. And so now we're running our own testing lab. We're now running our own vaccine program. You get what I'm saying? And I now have a cohort of people who are now commercializing technologies that are emanating from their labs. That's change. That's kind of how it happens, and that's kind of what it looks like. So I'm going to stop there in the essence of time and open it up for questions. Yeah, well, look, I will tell you that the biggest challenge is culture. And, academia, we have brilliant people on all sides of an issue. And because of that, oftentimes it's very, very difficult to come to a consensus, okay? And look, the reality of the situation is no matter how good your strategy is, no matter how good your analysis is, culture eats strategy for breakfast. That's not my quote. That's the quote of Peter Drucker, a famous CEO. And the reality is that you oftentimes have to deal with the outcomes that you have until you're able to start to manage or change the culture. How do you do that? You do it by some of the things that was highlighted, that I highlighted to you earlier. But changing culture is hard. It actually takes time. You look there, it took me 9 years to do everything that I did at UC Irvine. It took some time, okay? but that culture that's there now is a different culture than what it was when I arrived. It's an open and much more inclusive culture. It is a culture based not on, for lack of a better way of saying this, an entitlement. It's actually based on performance. And that performance-based culture is what determines how people were promoted and how they were paid and how they were hired. And so that's the thing. So it's one of the things that I'm incredibly proud of, but it's one of the things that's incredibly hard to do. My goodness. So that's a good question. Let me talk to you about the short-term problem first, because you're not going to like my long-term answer. I'm going to tell you that one. The short-term answer is we actually have to partner with industry, with non-governmental organizations, with state, local, and federal government. There has to be partnerships to provide students with what I call experiential learning, where you teach theory related to policy, you teach history related to policy, and all of that gives you an understanding, but it's book sense, right? You got to spend some time in field in order to take it and apply it and see what works and what doesn't work and how it does and how it doesn't. So one of the things I want to do here in the short term over the next couple of years is have an internship program where people, no matter major, can literally spend time outside of the classroom, significant time working on real problems related to your field. What most will find is that there's probably no better educator and there's no better way of motivating what you learn in the classroom than having that. Long term, and this is the part I say a lot of folk don't like, long term, we got to change our curriculum. The fact of the matter is this, there has been, that's why I spend so much time talking about how everything around us has changed, right? Dramatic change in our society and the way we live. And we're still teaching concepts and theories and methodologies that are literally 50, 60, 70 years old. And we get that they have historical value, but the reality of the situation is history is being rewritten as we speak. And the history that's happening now is happening 10, 15, 20, 25 times faster than that history that happened 15, 20 years ago. How do we know? Because the speed of communication makes it as such, right? When George Floyd was murdered, right? When you saw the whole thing with George Floyd, within a few weeks, literally within days, you had protests here in the US. But within a few weeks, you had protests all over the world because the information traveled that fast. Take this back to the time of Bill Clinton, right? Take this back to the time of Ronald Reagan when they were president. Absolutely no way that could have happened then. It just wasn't the informational frameworks in place for the data to travel that fast. You had 3 or 4 channels at the time. You had one, you would see something on the news, but this wasn't being transmitted by news media alone. It was social media that was behind this, and it wasn't no social media then. So our educational constructs haven't kept up with that. You understand what I'm saying? We use more PowerPoint now. I'm teaching to you all in Zoom, and all of those things are increases. I contend to you that they're not at the level, the actual they're helpful, but the actual content has to change. Okay? Absolutely. I saw in the Q&A a number of students highlighted some issues relative to workers on campus, some are custodial workers. I think there was an op-ed in the in the newspaper, in the Washington Post about this. Let me explain to you. This is a very interesting concept. You know, there was clearly some complaints that have been happening. They've been happening for years. When they were brought to my attention, you know, a few weeks ago, I started an internal investigation, and the internal investigation gave us some feedback, but I didn't think it was complete. And so what I did was I found an external organization to come and do a real honest to goodness audit, to talk to people, to talk to them in their own language, right? Because I can't send my staff and my people out to speak to someone who speaks Spanish. They're asking them questions in English. There was a mismatch there, right? And so there were all of these problems. And then if people, remember, these are Mason contractors. These aren't George Mason employees. But my feeling is that they're on this campus, they contract with the campus. We're ultimately responsible. And I understand the plight of custodial workers. Many of you may not realize it. I was a custodian at one time in my life. I've actually done that work. So I understand it better than most people on this campus because I've done it. Okay, I did it as a kid, as a youngster, and you know, and all the way up. So I'm a person that's for fair treatment. I'm also a person that says, first and foremost, you got to understand what happened. So that's why we're doing the audit, to get an understanding. Once we get an understanding, we will take action. I mean, to me, that's kind of how you resolve an issue. Okay, we will get down to the bottom of it, and there will be a full accounting of what happened. I get that it didn't, you know, this stuff happened before I got here, and I don't know why issues were not addressed by previous leadership. But look, I'm sitting in the seat now, and so they're my challenges to fix, and we'll fix them. I am not worried about that in the least bit, and I believe wholeheartedly that we're going to be the institution that you all can be really proud of, not just the institution who's here and gives you a degree. And there's another issue going on here too that I think our students and some of our faculty should also understand. Many of the individuals involved in this whole thing are they're members of underrepresented groups. They're Black and brown people, right, who are primarily custodians on this campus. And the main contractor that we have is a contractor that is also a minority contractor. They won the contract because they were one of the entities that bid the lowest when they made the bid for the contract. So I'm telling you everything all this happened before my time, but this is the reality. And so they got that contract. And what we know is that, you know, many of the other companies that were bidding against them, they're union shops, nothing wrong with that, but they're not owned and operated by people of color, right? And so in the end, what can happen is we could be removing this entity. We can wind up removing their contract, right? If we find that there was wrongdoing here, and or not renewing their contract. And if we do that, all of those people, all of those Black and brown people lose jobs. And then you bring in a whole different group of individuals, and it wasn't their fault, right? So we also have to understand that there are other dynamics here at work too. There are people who don't want businesses like that to have those contracts in our state. And so I'm also dealing with that issue too. And so as you start to peel back the onion, you understand that these things are much more complex than what they look like on the surface, and much more complex than you can get in a soundbite in a simple in a simple op-ed. Well, look, this is one that's near and dear to me as well. I spend a lot of time over the last 5 years in both India and China working to develop education pathways for students to make it here to the country, to engage. I will tell you that, and I don't want people to take this the wrong way, but because of the fact that we are Americans and we live in this country, we enjoy a certain level of blessings that many people in other countries just don't have. And I think it begins with that analysis. It begins with that understanding. People have to understand how blessed they are. Look, 500 million people in the world experience torture, imprisonment, or starvation right now as we speak. As you just said, there are more than 2 billion people right now on the planet who live on subsistence wages, as wages less than $4 a day. 75% of the world doesn't have access to one of the following: adequate clothing, or a refrigerator, or a place to sleep. 66% of the world's families don't own a car. The family doesn't own a car. Right? 1.3 billion don't have access to electricity. They light their homes with kerosene and candles. 2.4 billion still cook on an open fire, and 4 million die a year from smoke inhalation. Okay? In India alone, about 100 million people don't have access to clean water. Now, what is our responsibility given the blessings that we've gotten in this country? What is their responsibility? We have a responsibility not just to ourselves here, but we have one to the planet, right? To me, this is one of, if we don't teach that as outcomes for our students here at Mason, we would have failed them. If their job is only to leave here, get a good job, take care of themselves and their family, and not pay attention to what's happening in other places, we would have done them a disservice, right? And so it isn't, and where do you get that? You get it from discussions like this. You get it from people telling you these issues and telling you these entities. You know, look, to whom much is given, much is required. And we are blessed in this country. So there is a responsibility that we fundamentally have to help others in other places. I don't know if that's the answer to your question, but to me, that's kind of where it starts. I get it. Look, the greatest tool and lever we have right now is each other. And, you know, as I look across the spectrum of faculty here at Mason, I'm literally amazed at how many people have the levels of expertise to provide insight to those of us who don't have it. We actually have, the knowledge base is here. The people are actually here. They're known in other sectors, right? They're known in other educational quadrants where they speak and they produce their scholarly works and they engage. But we really hadn't had the right forum here on campus for them to engage the community and for there to be an exchange. That's part of one of the outcomes that we're going to have related to the task force. That's one of the recommendations that the group put forward, that there needs to be an intellectual ecosystem of exchange on our campus where people from different groups can have conversations, can have difficult ones. And it has to be a mechanism, to be totally honest with you, and I know that this strikes some people in a difficult way, but it has to be one where free speech is protected, right? We have to allow folk who disagree the ability to have that level of engagement, because that's how you hone and build your own understanding, is when it's challenged, right? And so what I will tell you, so I'm a supporter of free speech, but I also understand that free speech exerts a cost on the campus. And while we're willing to pay that cost as a campus, we have to understand that not all groups bear that cost the same. Some groups bear the cost of free speech in a much more rigorous way than others. And it's usually not the groups who perpetrate the speech, right? It's the groups who've received it, right? And so we have to manage that, but we have to allow them to have those conversations. And so I'm putting together a mechanism now to figure out how to do that. It's interesting because Schar is one of the places where you have faculty who debate on all sides, and we can have those discussions. And so as we start to roll these entities out, I look forward to hearing from you all to get feedback. So let me ask you. Let me answer the last part first.
Okay.
When I am up at night, the thing that bothers me is the coronavirus. To be totally honest with you, we're managing it. We're doing well than most large institutions in the country. As we're doing as well as or better than most large institutions in the country. The challenge point for me is that I know how infectious and contagious this virus is, and things can flip on us on a dime. And so I'm always worried about the health, of our students, our faculty and staff. You know, if we get a day where we're over 4 or 5 cases, I'm concerned and worried about it. And we're looking at what changes do we need to make in order to keep it from spreading. So that's the last part of that. Outside of that, there's not much that keeps me up. We're doing really, really well as a campus. And so there's really nothing to keep me up there. But what makes me smile? That's the great question. And look, it's the promise that's in front of us. This institution is uniquely positioned to really have a profound impact, not just on Virginia, but the whole country. We have put ourselves in a position where we can engage most students in the state. We can provide a pathway to an educational degree for every single Virginian who wants it. We actually can provide that. We can put mechanisms in place that if a person doesn't want to get a degree, we're structured to help them start a business, right? We manage all of the 33 SBDCs that are strewn throughout the state. You can go way out to Lee County and we have a facility there. And so there's no institution better at touching the lives of Virginians than this one. And what that means is that while there's great responsibility in that, there's such great promise, because I think we got the right people here. And if I can just figure out how we can work together and unlock the power and the potential that's here, we can make this state a shining example for the whole country. And that, to me, that's pretty cool. That is pretty cool.